When uncertainty becomes the only certainty, how do great leaders make smart decisions, grow their companies, and stay resilient, even without a clear playbook? Welcome to the Leadership Career Accelerator, where we help aspiring leaders like you build executive presence, influence with impact, and get recognized and promoted. I am longtime CEO Barry Moline. In this deep dive conversation with economist and leadership strategist Dr. Rebecca Homkes, you'll learn why uncertainty is not something to survive, it's something to lead through. Drawing from her global research with McKinsey, London Business School, and CEOs across industries, Rebecca shares an actionable approach to leadership in today's rapidly shifting environment of tariffs, taxes, tech, and tension. You'll discover the 3 most common and costly leadership traps in uncertain times: delusion, paralysis, and frenzy, and how to avoid them. You'll learn why focusing on beliefs over predictions builds strategic agility, and how no regrets moves can future-proof your decisions. And you'll gain a step-by-step guide to building internal predictability, leading with questions, and helping your team stay aligned, adaptive, and resilient, no matter what the headlines say. You're going to learn how uncertainty can become your organization's greatest advantage, and how leaders like you can grow and perform in the most unpredictable times. Let's get into it. Well, welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Barry. It's my pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, we're here talking about leadership and elements of leadership, and I'm wondering about your journey to become a leader. And can you describe it, and along the way talk about a few of the big lessons that you've learned?
Yeah, Barry, thanks for asking. I think it's funny because sometimes when we hear being a leader, you assume you must be running a company of hundreds, if not thousands of employees. And leadership can mean lots of different things, right? So I moved to London right out of university. I won something called the Marshall Scholarship, where there's about 30 in the country. It was never part of the plan. I was one of those had a plan people. I was going to work at McKinsey or Bain or Goldman Sachs. I was going to then get my MBA. I was then going to work for a private equity firm. Like, it was all lined out, right? And then I got the Marshall, and you don't say no to that. So I moved to London, and I was like, great, 2 years, I'm back to DC, back to McKinsey, back to the plan. And was fortunate enough to get accepted into the PhD program at the London School of Economics. And luckily had a very good friend who said, Rebecca, you would be silly to not do this. You're going to stay and get your PhD that's paid for, and you're just going to see where this takes you. And I was super lucky because when I was doing my PhD, McKinsey, the consulting firm, was actually collaborating with the London School of Economics to study something interesting to our conversation, which was, does management and leadership matter? Which, we talk all the time that it matters, but economists had never tried to quantify it. So the very first thing that I did was get to be part of what fast became a global team that I eventually helped run to quantify whether organizations, we started with manufacturing, eventually moved to hospitals, education, et cetera, if they were better managed, were they more productive? The answer is yes, unequivocally, by the way. But what's interesting about this study was we were doing it in '08. And for those on the call who remember what '08 and '09 was like, that was going into the global financial crisis. So we were sitting here with some very powerful finding for governments around the world that we know you're capital constrained right now, but if you can boost the management quality of your manufacturing plants, you can dramatically boost national productivity. So while I was doing my PhD, I ended up running the team that helped do a lot of this study, was traveling around the world speaking about this, and then realized that I didn't want to go back and be a consultant when I'd already had all of these other opportunities. So I moved to London Business School and moved from economics to strategy, taught strategy for a bit. And you really can't make it up, Barry. I did a program with YPO, which stands for the Young Presidents Organization. It's a global network of CEOs. Taught some programs there. Some of them asked me to do some consulting. And I'm, of course, simplifying, but my thought was, well, I'll just do this consulting, business school teaching thing till it stops working. Then I'll move back to the U.S. and get a real job. And I'm very happy to say I did eventually move back to the U.S., but never had to get a real job. And since I was in my mid to late 20s, have been teaching executive education at wonderful business schools and working directly with CEOs who want to grow their companies. And that's what I do. I wake up every day just excited about what it's going to take to create value across industries and get to work with wonderful CEOs and teams who are trying to do that.
Wow, that's great. And what a cool study that you were engaged in. I have a follow-up on that, which is, how do we know that leaders matter?
Well,
what is the evidence?
If you allow me to geek out on the methodology for just 1 minute, this is why I love this. And I transferred the same work over into strategy execution. Is the punchline is most surveys are really terrible because we are really bad at self-assessing ourselves. So if I send a survey out and say, Barry, would you rate yourself on your management or leadership qualities? You might get there, right? Because you do this for a living, but most of us over-assess. So instead, what we did is we built an 18-question grid on performance management, talent management, and operations management. And we hired MBA students who spoke the native language of that country, brought these MBA students into campus at London School of Economics, and they called plant managers and would just say, I'm an MBA student in London. I'm doing a project on management back in my home country. I'd love to interview you. And the MBA students would interview the manager anywhere from 40 minutes to an hour, ask them the questions, but it was a conversation. And so what we were attempting to do was quantify qualitative information. And so they were scored on a 1 to 5. And that methodology is super powerful, again, because you basically move, a Likert scale, strongly agree, mostly agree, to just a set of conversations and questions. And so that was the methodology that we used during that point. And it turns out it's significantly not just correlated, but we can actually link it back to causation, that when these management principles and leadership principles are in place about understanding what we're trying to achieve, tracking performance, building buy-in with the team, we lead to significantly more productivity.
Wow. Yeah. That's really interesting. And then you measured the productivity of those specific companies?
And then we match those companies back against productivity with publicly available data and do lots of studies on that. Yeah.
So when they had purpose and accountability and had a team that they brought together
and buy-in, then those organizations were significantly more productive.
Wow, that's really interesting. The only other study that I was aware of was about sales, where sales of the company was used as the measure of success. And in those cases, what they found was that this is just pertaining to sales, was that the best salespeople don't make the best managers.
Yes.
Because they know how to do it, but they don't know how to convey it to others, how to do what they do. But that's sidebar. Fascinating that you're involved in that, and good to know that leadership is important.
Yes, leadership and management does matter, yes.
Yeah, great. So in your book, Survive, Reset, and Thrive, you talk about the leadership advantage hidden inside uncertainty. And we have, in the U.S., a lot of uncertainty now. I think from a national perspective, it seems like the rules are changing around us. We have a lot of ups and downs when it comes to tariffs. Our tax structure is changing. There are political tensions that are sort of upsetting the apple cart in business, and a lot of businesses aren't sure what to do. And a lot of times when that happens, people don't invest. When they know the rules of the road, they can say, I'm going to deploy my capital and we're going to have an outcome. I know what the parameters are. But when the rules change, it's much harder. At least it feels to me that it's much harder for businesses to invest. So what's your reflection on that?
Uncertainty is the new certainty. That is really easy to say. That is hard to lead through because our playbooks, tools, and frameworks aren't built for uncertainty. Classic strategy management tools have kind of the change, as a risk, as something to adjust for. You mentioned the trifecta: tariffs, taxes, tensions. And look, U.S. uncertainty becomes global uncertainty, and we need to acknowledge that as well, right? Is the word uncertainty, there's something really powerful about it, I noticed, and this was before current administration, this was before COVID, is I realized that, Barry, whenever we talk to each other about uncertainty, we tend to put a word before it that means it's going to be bad. So we ask each other, hey, how are you handling uncertainty? Or how are you managing uncertainty? Or how are you thinking about getting through this uncertainty? Without meaning to, we almost always preface the word uncertainty with another word that frames our brains as going to be bad. And this is actually really harmful for our growth mindset, but also how we transfer that energy onto our teams. So my premise starting point was, look, I'm an economist by trade. You define things. So I said, well, let's define uncertainty. The definition of uncertainty is a series of future events which may or may not occur. Whether or not those events are good or bad depends on what we're trying to do and how we're set up. And that becomes a leadership role. Figure out what you're trying to do and then get set up to succeed in whatever that world will be.
So I guess that feeds into a question about decision making, and that is whether we delay our decision making in uncertain times or we just plow through and decide, invest, and then I think what you're saying is in the process of decision making, account for the possibility that the rules could change.
Yeah, I love this, Barry. And if we take a pause, there's a funny paradox about uncertainty when it comes to leading a company or a team. It's actually easier to lead through a downturn or a recession than it is through uncertainty, because we actually have playbooks for what we need to do in a recession or a downturn. These playbooks aren't necessarily fun or sexy, but we kind of know what to do. It's uncertainty that stumbles us, right? Because then we don't really have this established playbook. So when I watch companies struggling with uncertainty, and you mentioned some of them, I see three pretty common responses. The first is delusion, where we just ignore it. And there's good reasons for this, right? It's not hubris, but you'll say, look, the board already knows the plan. The team already knows the plan. We've communicated it. It gets silly sometimes, but they'll say, but the posters are already on the wall, Rebecca, right? This is the plan. And we just kind of plow ahead. And that's delusion, right? But the second response is paralysis, where we just delay. We say, well, let's wait a couple months. Let's wait till we know the final tariff level. Let's wait till after the tax bill. I had this funny thing where a lot of CEOs in January would tell me, you know, Rebecca, we're going to hold off on any major decisions until after the summer when the Trump administration has settled down. Like somehow magically after a couple of months, things would fall into place. And Barry, why paralysis is challenging is not just the delayed decision making, but growth and performance is a muscle, right? And when you keep delaying by months and then more months and eventually years, moving on growth and performance, you lose the muscle. It's just like if you stop going to the gym, your muscles are going to atrophy, and it's the same thing for an organization. So the second thing is paralysis. And the third is just what I call frenzy, where we know things aren't working, things feel uncomfortable. We don't want to commit to one thing because we're afraid we'll get it wrong. So we just throw 1,000 things at the market and hope something sticks. So delusion, paralysis, and frenzy characterize a lot of the responses. Now, I've labeled them in a way that hopefully signifies these are not the recommended course of action. But I just want to pause and make the punchline really clear is uncertainty is a great time for growth and performance. Great doesn't mean easy, but empirically, not just sexy to say, uncertainty is a great time to grow and perform. And as leaders, this should be your time, right? When things get a bit tough, this is when we need leaders even more.
So how do you get past those, I would call them speed bumps, not barriers.
Love it. Yeah.
Those are the things that are holding leaders back from making those decisions.
Yeah. The first thing that we need to do is acknowledge that we can't predict the future. And I know that sounds silly when I say it out loud like that, but this is actually getting increasingly worse with AI. Because you can put a question into your GPT of choice and it will pump something back with such authority. And we can do modeling and we almost are kidding ourselves that we can predict the future. We can't, right? The role of leaders is how do we make great decisions even though we can't make great predictions? This is the capability you need to build with your team, making great decisions even though we can't make great predictions. And that involves some slightly different ways. And one of them I call the shift from planning to preparing. And I'm going so far, language matters, as to wonder, maybe let's stop calling them strategic plans or the strategic planning process. Because, Barry, there's just something about the word plan that frames our brain, everything in this must get done, right? And your growth strategy is a living, breathing document, right, that needs to adjust and shift as the situation shifts. So moving from planning mode to preparation mode, where you're making decisions based on beliefs. You're okay with variables emerging as you go, and you're optimizing for robustness, kind of not just extreme efficiency.
So does that mean in a strategic prep, not a strategic plan.
Yeah.
That you're essentially looking at different futures or different potential outcomes and what we would do in this case and what we might do in this case and what we might do in this case. And no matter how the future turns out, and it may not be specifically in one of those three ways, you've at least thought through the process and can more easily shift because your mindset has moved toward agility rather than just one singular road.
Yeah, and that's a key part of the reset process. So scenario planning is helpful if you build capability based on them. Unfortunately, a lot of teams do scenario planning and it lives as a very pretty PowerPoint on someone's desk. I like to turn what I call the reset, kind of the pause and the reset, into a couple of questions. And the questions are, what's going on and how's it going to change? And what is success? So where are we going to play? How are we going to win? What could stop us? So what should we do? It's a very simple story, but your first question is very powerful. What's going on and how is it going to change? And sitting with the team and identifying the top trends, we mentioned some of them, taxes, tariffs, tensions, but we also have a shifting consumer and potentially a cost-conscious consumer, right, who is shifting some of their spending patterns. We have an emerging consumer, with Gen X the Gen Alpha. And what teams tend to do is they just talk about the trends. And what we need to do is articulate our beliefs. So belief is like a stance, our midterm view of how something's going to pan out. We're not trying to predict the future because we can't, but we're aligning on our beliefs. Because when teams often disagree on choices, it's almost always because they haven't aligned on beliefs. And what we tend to do as entrepreneurs is we articulate a trend and then we go to the implication. I am seeing tariffs, therefore I must stockpile inventory, right? Trend to implication. And the power of leading through uncertainty is that purposeful pause in the middle and say, well, what are our beliefs? Where do we believe tariffs will end up over the midterm? Where do we believe that will be most kind of a consequence? Do we have any no regret moves? So think of Barry completing this sentence. We are seeing X and we believe Y, which means Z for us. Taking that bit of time to align on beliefs helps us in that agility, right? Because we all know we've already spent time doing. Then execution becomes about this parallel pathing. Yes, I'm executing my strategy, but I'm also testing my beliefs. And as I get affirmation about my beliefs, I'm resourcing those priorities more. But as my beliefs might be disproven or a bit questionable, I might pull back a bit. But leading through uncertainty is fundamentally about parallel pathing. I'm executing, but I'm stress testing my beliefs. Because we still need to prioritize and focus on just a few things. And we often don't want to prioritize because we're afraid we'll get something wrong because we know the situation's change. So my suggestion is move from investing in 20 bets to the 3 or 5 your team can actually resource appropriately, but do this parallel pathing of the belief testing.
So I want to clarify the phrase no regret moves or no regret decisions, in that we're talking about actions that you can take that would work in any scenario, in any economy, right? That's basically what you're talking about, correct?
I love no regret moves. And they're a great question to ask because you often have some. So a no regret move is defined as, even if our beliefs were wrong, we would not regret making this move. So if we articulated a belief around tariffs or a changing consumer, this move would be the right decision regardless of whether or not our belief pans out. So for instance, shutting down 3 facilities is a regret move. If you got your beliefs wrong, you might regret doing that. But vetting new suppliers is a no regret move, right? Because now I've got this optionality should I need to move and kind of pivot to something else. And trying to isolate those, they also give this feeling of almost power to the team who can sometimes go into that paralysis. If you can just say, okay, we've had this robust discussion, we've articulated our beliefs, but have we identified any no regret moves that we can start acting on even as we're working on our longer midterm strategy?
And where does a bold move fit in? Sometimes you just need to go all in, or at least have a portion of your portfolio going all in, even if it's a group that is more entrepreneurial, that's part of the company, but it's not betting the entire company. Where do they fit in?
So they absolutely fit in, right? And one thing here is that articulating your beliefs before your choices gives you a lot of power in this. What we tend to do is just because we're worried about a confusing message or how many things people can remember, we just communicate the choices. These are our two priorities. We're going all in these two markets. But what happens, Barry, is if the situation changes, we kind of feel stuck, right? Because we spent so long communicating this big move that we're going to make. But if we start by saying, these are our top 3 to 5 strategic beliefs, because of these beliefs, we're going to make these big, bold moves. But as I'm executing these moves, again, I'm parallel pathing and testing my beliefs. And when, as a leader, I communicate our beliefs first, 2 things happen. 1, I've given myself permission to change, which is super important. But 2, I just recruited a bunch more testers because now my distributed leaders across the organization are also helping me test those beliefs and look in the market. So this isn't, again, another misperception about uncertainty. We think we should only make small, timid moves. No, this is absolutely the time to make some of those bigger moves, but be super clear in your beliefs. And again, that parallel pathing is so important.
Really interesting. How can leaders help their teams stay focused?
Yeah, focus is probably one of the top questions that I get, right? And we often claim that we're focused, but we're focused on 3 pillars. And the problem with focusing on pillars is pillars become buckets. So if our focus is profitable growth, innovation, and AI, I can do anything I want to do as someone on your team because I can somehow justify it across those pillars, right? So I like to move to very clearly midterm growth-focused priorities and keep that list short, right? These are just our 3 to 5 must-wins over the next few years. But let's remember, Barry, ruthless prioritization is key, but you need to do that while building a capability of adaptability. We need both of them. We need focus and adaptability. Adaptability without focus is chaos. Everyone's doing whatever they want to do. Focus without adaptability, then yes, we can make some bets wrong. The real secret power is that dual capability, super focused on the few things that will really move the needle while building this capability of adaptability across the organization.
Yeah, that's a lot of leadership that is required, seriously, to stay on top of what's going on in society. So today, we're looking at an environment where, let's see, so there's some tariff chaos, although it appears as though some of that has died down. And interestingly, my reflection on it is because the president has imposed, at least at a minimum, I think it's a 10% tariff across the board, either 10 or 15 across the board. And there hasn't been a lot of squealing about that. That has stuck. And with a few countries, the tariff is higher. And then there's some punitive cases that the president doesn't like what's going on. And those are just unusual. But the fact that tariffs have gone up by this modest amount says to me that I guess that other countries were taking advantage of us. If people have, they're absorbing that payment. And yes, we can argue about who pays the tariff. Is it companies shrinking in profits? Is it you and I in prices of our goods? But still, that's just an interesting situation. So we have tariffs that may or may not be settling down. There was a tax bill that was passed, and I don't imagine that another tax bill or tax changes are going to be significant, at least for the next few years. Yeah, there are a lot of political tensions, but those generally don't bleed down into a lot of what corporations do on a day-to-day basis. We're also seeing consumers sort of pulling back their spending. And as we move into the Christmas season, we're going to see, but there's a lot of comparison to previous holidays and buying. But what we hear is consumers are slowing spending, which slows the economy because consumer spending is a big part of the economy. And I guess the question is, well, 1, what else am I missing? Yeah. And 2 is, what do companies do in this moment when they see consumers are pulling back?
So what I say about our current situation, Barry, is tell me the story you want to tell, and I'll make the data tell that story. Right? Is we have so many data points right now that are giving us some varying pictures, right? And the tariff impact is a bit different. We haven't seen it all come out yet. What we saw was that because there was such uncertainty of where the levels would fall out, companies took a lot more of that on than people, including myself, anticipated, right? Because we kind of get obsessed and we think, oh, well, everyone's like Amazon, this real-time pricing engine. For the majority of companies, changing prices is actually a multi-week to multi-month process of negotiation with partners and then reticketing. And that's not a cost you want to bear multiple times, again, for the majority of companies. So there was a bit of a pause of, let's see where this settles out. Then we can start making decisions. So we really haven't seen the pricing impact yet. A lot of that will hit in Q4. That said, because especially the China pause happened over the summer, there was a lot of pull forward of inventory. So a lot of the goods that we would see for a Christmas season were already on U.S. soil before a lot of those tariffs went into play because of the 90-day pause. So we're going to have a messy picture. So come January, the tariff fans are going to say, see, we told you there's no pricing impact. But again, remember, those goods were already in the country. And the tariff opponents are going to say, well, hold on, because we're going to start seeing it now. So let's just be very aware it's a pretty messy data picture because of the pauses and the uncertainty. What we are seeing is, the simplest way to describe it is about a third, a third, a third. So companies are absorbing about a third of the cost. They're passing around a third on to their value chain, partners, suppliers, et cetera, and going to pass about a third on to consumers. That will vary, of course, but roughly, if you're trying to do some averaging the averages, that's roughly where we're going to pan out. We do have a super cautious consumer. So a lot of companies will say, well, I don't have a tariff impact. But because tariffs were in the news so much, it actually bleeds into consumer psyche, right? So even if your individual goods are domestically made, you might still have a cost price conscious consumer because they've heard all this buzz around tariffs and they're concerned about future spending, which means they're going to pull back on spending right now. So kind of the consumer uncertainty around tariffs is actually going to be a bigger impact on most companies this year than necessarily what that price label looks like, which is something that we need to think about. Consumer confidence is down a bit, not historically, especially in the US, a little bit more so in places like the UK. Retail sales are down a bit, nothing dramatic, and unemployment is starting to fall, but still at historically high averages. Inflation is up, but not spiking. So it's a challenge for policymakers, right? It's also a challenge for leaders, right, who are trying to grapple with all of these data points. And so that's where we go back to articulate your beliefs, do the parallel pathing of the testing, and really lean into some of these other elements. Our job as leaders is to create what I call internal predictability when you're facing external uncertainty, right? And build an environment where you can put some consistency into your team day to day. The media has normalized chaos to a pretty astonishing degree. You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, every day we get another news story, what feels like a different normal. Boards and leadership teams can't normalize chaos because they need to run businesses and create shareholder value and take care of their employees and their communities. And this is a real tension that if we're not careful and don't get on top of it, it's going to burn out our leaders and it's going to burn out our teams, right? Because it's so much to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And thanks for clarifying the picture.
Yeah.
I think what I heard you say is the situation is not dire.
Yeah.
And there are some potential shifts on the horizon, but they're more shifts rather than falling off a cliff.
There's shifts, right? Let me make my punchline super clear. Uncertainty is a great time to grow and perform, right? I want to be really clear on that. Now, it's not easy. I've mentioned this a couple times. I don't particularly need easy stuff, but it's a great time, Barry. Now, one of the reasons it's great is a lot of organizations are stuck in delusion, paralysis, or frenzy. So if you can avoid that, you've got one step up. But the real power of uncertainty is this. When uncertainty is high, something else is high as well, and that's honesty. When consumers, partners, customers, and employees are facing uncertainty, they get much more honest. What do I really value? What's a true differentiation to me versus more features? When times are more certain or things are frothy, consumers and customers will try a bunch of stuff, and it's very difficult to get good feedback. Again, uncertainty is high, honesty is high. Uncertainty is a great time to grow because it's a great time to learn. And organizations that learn faster are organizations that grow faster. If I can just share one punchline of spending over 15 years working with high growth companies, it's those 4 words. Learn faster, grow faster. Organizations that learn faster are organizations that grow faster.
And in learning faster, leaders have to listen to a lot of people in their company. Obviously, we can do surveys or pay attention to external data, but a lot of times ideas are coming from the people in our company. They know our company best. Yeah. And sometimes, familiarity breeds contempt and we don't listen to our people.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, in the 2008 timeframe, I was leading a trade association of electric utilities, and we noticed that our utility members were strained with their budgets because consumers who were in difficult situations were not paying them.
Yes.
So they didn't have as much money to grow and invest in capital projects, and they didn't have as much money to spend with their trade association. And our team looked at the external forces and what was going on in the economy and what was happening within our members' utilities in terms of this budget constraint. And we decided to offer an extremely low cost education program where we would go out to our members and we'd be paying our own travel and our own salaries and deliver soft skill training that they had just completely cut out because things like leadership training and management training and so on, because they figured we'll do this again in a couple years and we'll survive with the managers we have and we're not going to worry about elevating their education and so on. So we upgraded our training and then said, you can have it for practically nothing. And it got very popular fast because we were filling a void that they had cut back. And then when the economy turned around 2010, 2011, when they became more flush with revenue, then we started to raise the price of our training because now they could pay for it. And it turned out in that downturn, because we talked about a service that our customers needed and that we got in at the rock bottom level, that they became hooked on the service. They loved the service. Yeah. And it all came out of just sitting around with our own staff and saying, what can we do?
Knowing a customer. Every trend is an opportunity. Our job as leaders is prioritizing which ones we want to take in this cycle, right? This is why you're never supposed to criticize tools or frameworks, especially as a business school professor. But this is why I don't like SWOTs, right? Or things like that, because a lot of frameworks force us to clarify things as good or bad. And that shuts down half of our growth mindset, right? So again, yes, terrible recession, consumer spending gone, our members gone, but you say, okay, great. They still value our relationship as a trade association, right? What job can we do for them now that they need, which will further build that moats and that value we offer them? That is leaning into something and creating a great growth opportunity, which is what leadership through uncertainty is all about.
Yeah, fascinating. And would you say that a product like, I don't know exactly what it's called, the Meta glasses?
Yes.
I've only just heard about them. Maybe I saw a paragraph on what they do, but basically you can access AI through your glasses. I'm not really sure. Maybe there's a microphone where you can listen to stuff, and I'm not sure how you might see things, but there's a lot there that's in the glasses. So is something like that just part of the 10 to 20% of the company that is innovating, where the other 80 to 90% is focused on the core work, the core revenue that you're doing?
Well, every company, the big tech companies are all experimenting in different ways with a combination of virtual reality, augmented reality, and AI. And they're going to get a lot of things wrong in that, which we need companies to get things wrong sometimes, right? So I don't like it, again, when we say, oh, this product failed. It's like, well, they just did some free testing for everybody else because now we can learn from them, right? And I love when companies put products out there a bit too early, because a lot of times they do flop, but we got some learnings from those. And so I do anticipate that we're going to see some new product offerings. Look, Thrive companies innovate during uncertainty and downturns, right? The ones who aren't innovating during uncertainty and downturns are the ones who weren't prepared for it, who need to go back to kind of to that playbook. But yeah, there's some really cool things happening. We're a convergence of technological adaptation, social change, right? Geopolitical change. And when you have that level of convergence, we see new things and can test out all of these new value propositions. No, so again, most of these early products don't have a there yet, right? They have a small minority of people who are Advent fans and the majority who try them once or twice and put them on the shelf. But I remain pretty bullish on what the next generation of these things will look like when we start to combine some of these things for more practical use. But that's, again, leaning into what is that differentiated value proposition I can really provide to my customers that's going to start creating those moats. There's real power in creating those moats around customers. Mm.
We've talked about the macro level. Yes. Let's talk about individuals. What do you think are the skills that today's employees need to be successful?
So many, Barry. Do we have another hour, right? Is one, a couple shifts. And I'll try to make it as simple as possible. One shift is very, for lack of a better word, traditional or old-fashioned leadership training was about having the answers, right? Being able to lead the team and have the answers. Leadership on uncertainty is asking the right questions, like training our team to ask questions of our team and ask questions of the market, and embrace that shift. Your job as a leader, you don't know all the answers. You can't predict the future, but you can be really great at asking the right questions. The second is creating what I call internal predictability. Right? I know it's not a sexy phrase, but economists like to call things what they are, is when we're facing external uncertainty, our job as leaders is to create this internal predictability, which says, hey, I can't change every aspect of the future. I can't predict it. But I can create an environment, right, where my team knows how they're supposed to adapt. And you build internal predictability when everyone in your team can answer yes to 4 questions, right? And the questions are, I know what we're trying to achieve. I know where decisions take place. I can rely on others to do what they say they will do. And when I do adapt, it's recognized and rewarded. Now, those questions sound really simple. They're actually sometimes difficult to do in practice. But again, that's our job, creating this internal predictability. And part of that comes from consistency, giving a town hall at the same time every month or every week, having kind of a huddle at the same time. When you can create little bits of consistency in an environment which is borderline chaotic, it goes far in creating this internal predictability.
Yeah, that's really good advice. It's really, I don't know if I'd say it's hard to do. I think a leader or a leadership team needs to decide on the culture and then implement that culture, and then sticking with it. That is harder to do. Yeah. It does provide a lot of benefits over time, but I think it's hard to do. People look to leaders to have all the questions. To have all the answers. And when a leader says, let's all ask a lot of questions because none of us has all the answers, let's look at this puzzle together and try to figure it out. Yeah.
Let me share something with you, Barry, on the word hard, is that when I turned the first draft of the book in and got, some feedback from the editor, his biggest point of feedback was he said, Rebecca, you need to change something about the book. And I was thinking, what? And he said, you say this is hard too often. Too many times you tell the leaders, that this is hard, and no one likes hard stuff. So can you rephrase that so all of this feels more approachable? And look, we talked a lot about feedback today. Feedback is really important. You need to listen to this feedback, and I internalized it. And I said, no, I can't change the language because this stuff is really hard. But then I just had this moment of clarity I'll never forget. And I said, but when you do the hard things well, that's differentiation, right? And that's what this whole game is all about. So we need to stop changing language so things feel more approachable when they actually are quite difficult. And instead, as a leader, say, when we do hard things well as a team, that's differentiation. That's what our job is all about.
Yeah, really interesting. So as a professional yourself, how do you continuously learn? What kind of things do you do? What do you read? Do you take any classes? What do you listen to? Is there anything you do to continuously learn?
It's the best part about my job, Barry. I get to learn every day, all day long. It is the best part of my job is I have conversations with CEOs and teams from every industry, from every culture, all around the world. I get to see how different teams are seeing trends differently. I get to really challenge and learn about different ways to create differentiation, what's working and what's not working, and building communication. But I'm also very purposeful about it on an individual level. And I think routine is important. I'm a very routine person. So I work out first thing in the morning, every morning. And I'm a bit cliche about that. I've got CNBC or Bloomberg on, or I listen to my podcast or Audible when I'm running. That's when I take my notes. That's when I think, and that's a non-negotiable time. It doesn't matter what time zone I'm in. First thing in the morning is always for that individual time. The day is for the clients and the companies and the conversations. And the evening when I kind of write my notes, that's capturing all the insights and getting ready for the next day. But I've got the best job in the world because there's not a day I don't learn.
Well, that's great. And it's great to have all those habits that keep you plugged in to your continuous learning. So I have a question about advice.
Yes.
One is, tell me some good advice that you've received in your entire lifetime.
Oh, goodness. Now, that's hard because obviously you get a lot of advice. When you teach at a business school, you get advice on a daily basis. So let me share maybe a more macro one than a more micro one. And the micro one actually might have changed me just as much. And I referenced at the very beginning of our conversation, I was always a plan person. This is the plan. You stick to the plan. You do everything to get the plan. And the best advice I ever got was, when opportunities open, right, just lean in and say yes. It's okay to say yes to something that's off plan. And I know that sounds cliche, but we need to remind ourselves that just because something that pops up that wasn't in the original plan might be a much better pathway. And every single time I did that, it was. So be okay to go off script and say yes sometimes, right? There's a reason that these things happen. And the second I'm going to share, just because, again, it's going to sound really simple, but it really did change things, is one of the first, when I was in college and started doing public speaking, I asked for feedback. And my college mentor said, most people don't actually want feedback. Do you actually want feedback? And I said, yes. And the feedback he gave me was smile. He said, too often when we're talking about tough stuff like economics or strategy or leadership, we feel that we have to be so serious. He said, when you smile, everything changes. So just smile. And when I worked at a business school as a very young female, I was told, don't smile, look serious. And luckily, I took my original feedback. And that is probably the number one thing people say to me at the end of something is, I just wanted to lean in. So stuff is hard. Doesn't mean that we can't smile while we're talking about it. So that's probably one of the best pieces of feedback I ever got.
That is great advice and feedback. There's a quick story where Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball player, was playing for the Lakers, and he was having a lot of difficulties with Kobe Bryant, and they were warring on the same team.
Yeah.
And Shaq was known as kind of a rough guy, and I don't know, his personality, his external personality was not a happy one. And around the same time, he started to seek out Magic Johnson, who had retired and was a successful business person growing a lot of businesses. And Johnson said, yeah, I'll sit down with you and Shaq. And he spent a lot of time together. And one of the most important pieces of advice that Johnson said to O'Neal is, you got to smile more, man. People like to be around pleasant people. So if you're walking around with a frown on your face, and you've got to smile. And what's interesting about the just smile element, which has to be backed up with skill and ability and so on, is that when you see Shaq on TV now with, he does a lot of commercials for different things. I think he does something with computers printers.
Yes.
And he's dancing and he's smiling and he's doing those things. Whereas 15 years ago, he was Mr. Frown and really full of anger. And just that one thing has opened many doors for him, and he's got a lot of businesses going on, put it that way. And it's not just because he smiles and there's nothing behind it. He's smiling and he's also thinking strategically too. We just don't know the value of the smile. People like being around pleasant people. Yeah. So last question.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for young people who are just starting in their career? So something other than smile.
Yes. Wow. Well, smile, but more so, I think two things, and I'm going to repeat just because I think that's important, and they really are the two clarifying, is the biggest trap you can get when you're young is to go into heads down execution mode. You've got the plan and you go heads down, especially in the way our world is changing right now. I want everyone to be in heads up learning mode. So just be heads up learning mode. And on that, remember, uncertainty is scary because it's paralyzing. But uncertainty is merely a series of future events which may or may not occur, right? Whether or not those events are good or bad depends on what you're trying to do and how you're set up. And go back to that anchor, because it's all just figure out what you're trying to do and then get set up. Lots of uncertainty will happen, and that can be a great thing.
Well, that's great advice. Thank you very much, Rebecca. I've learned so much from our conversation, and I'm really eager to share it with others. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Wrapping up, what's the one thing you can implement today? There are a lot of ideas in this episode, but I think the most important action you can take is to implement no regrets actions. No regrets decisions allow you to implement immediately, and if something turns out to be wrong, the actions can be reversed. I've done these my entire career with a lot of success. When you have complicated decisions before you, do the easy, reversible ones first. Thank you for listening, and congratulations. You are a member of the End of the Show Club. If you have any questions or want to get in touch, you can send me a note. The address is leadershipcareeraccelerator@gmail.com. And check out and engage with me on Substack at Leadership Career Accelerator.